It is a truth universally acknowledged that if I get my hands on a hot lady character, then I'm going to scratch my little monkey brain for like 2.5 seconds and go, I think that's a lesbian. And I think I'm right to do so. Maybe it's just because I'm gay and I love Austen, but gay people love Austen. And that is what I'm going to be talking about today. Well, not gay people loving Austen, although this gay person does love Austen and I will be talking about me, I guess, so maybe technically yes. But really, this is actually a series about Jane Austen and the work that she has written and how there is kind of queer stuff going on in it and how she herself was probably a big old les. Don't quote me on that, but maybe do. Maybe do, I don't know. Maybe you'll find something in this that you'll be like, quote her on that, because like, proof. So I'm doing this series, which is my first series. Technically, and this is a real classic move on my part, I was like, oh, I'm going to start with something small. I'm going to start with a video that will be like maybe like 15 minutes long and it'll be just like a one-off and be really easy to do. And instead I started writing the script for this and now I have 3 videos that I have to do, but they're all really fun. So in a way, I feel like we've all won. So this first one that I'm going to do is about Jane Austen and her actual life. So I'm going to talk about some of the letters that she wrote, some of her relationships, some of the scandals, and mostly though how I think that she is a big old les. So I hope you enjoy that. And then the next video, if you would like to join me on this journey that I am taking on this channel where I'll be talking about queer shit and media and fun stuff like that, I will be talking about Pride and Prejudice and how there's like some really interesting queer readings that you can take from that. Mary Bennett, Charlotte Lucas, and need I say more? But then with the third one, I'll be talking about Emma and how, she is a huge lesbian. So that should be fun, and I hope you guys enjoy it. So let's start here. I have already filmed this video once, and in fact, have filmed the second video as well because technically it was supposed to be just one, and then I started doing it, and I started cutting it, and it was 2.5 hours worth of footage, and also I hadn't connected the mic properly. So, I feel like I've learnt heaps already in this process. I did a lot of editing of those 2 videos, and all of those hours will be gone, but they're not to waste, not to waste. It's all a process, all a learning process. Yay, so glad to be starting this journey with you all. So exciting. Now, maybe it's not that interesting that people look at Jane Austen's work and go, oh, that's some hetero bullshit. Because, like, sure, on the surface, that's some hetero bullshit, but it's fun. But also, if you're me, who can see queer anywhere, I see queer in it, and I want to talk about it. And so first of all, I'm going to look at Jane Austen's actual life in this video. And I think what's been kind of interesting when I have been doing the reading for this is I've like come up against a lot of opposition to the idea of like seeing anything about Jane Austen herself or like her work as being queer at all. And I think there's like always been some pushback from academics, and particularly from Jane Austen academics who like are wild, and I mean love them to death. There's like some really fucking interesting stuff going on in the world of Austen academia. And my God, the work that I have been able to pull from this is like purely because of the like super, super interesting stuff that has been written and like talked about already and the amazing historians and so on. But there definitely is a lot of pushback against the idea of like seeing any of Austen's work or like Austen herself as even like semi-adjacent to queer. Like, man, the way like some of the stuff that I have been reading over the last few weeks, they do not want to talk about it. They do not want to even like think about the idea of Austen being queer, like even a little bit. It's just like, I mean, yeah, it's kind of interesting. Now, I think for like any of us who are even like vaguely interested in the idea of like queer studies or anything like that, we all know the well-worn trope of historians or biographers looking at like very close female and male friendships and going, they are clearly excellent friends, or they were just roommates, and props to them for spending their entire lives together and never marrying, and all of their letters talking about how much they loved each other. What wonderful besties. Obviously it's beyond a joke at this point, and the world of Austen and like Austen academia is certainly no different. Now, I'm not going to be crazy and say that I think like there's really clear evidence that Jane was a dyke, but I think that it is really interesting that like we know that there's a lot of stuff missing from Austen's life. Like we don't have a lot of her letters, which I'll talk about why later because that's super interesting. Um, and so there's sort of like all this mystery around it. But the stuff that we do have, there's possibilities of reading kind of queerness into some of it. Because like if you read some of the letters, they're, like I said, they're not like super, super obvious, but they do show like really deep emotional connections between her and other women. And like some of them would seem pretty intimate by today's standards. And sure, like you can make the argument, like most of these historians are doing, that these sort of intimate seeming letters are just like, that's just how women's friendships were back in the day, and like that it was just a different time and blah blah blah. But yeah, I do think it's kind of interesting to think about why we're so quick to look at these close friendships and cordon them off from any kind of queer or romantic undertones. Feels like there's this kind of almost like academic tradition of looking at historical figures and trying to keep them in their proper lanes, which like obviously to them means heterosexual, even though we're pretty aware of the fact that like the past was just as filled with complex, like layered queer relationships as there are now. It's just that maybe they're a little more hidden than they are now. And yeah, I feel like the resistance to even speak about any kind of queer readings of her life or her work speaks more to modern discomforts and, let's be real, homophobia than it does to anything that she might have actually experienced or her intentions. Now, I guess it's pretty fair to say it's not as clear with Jane Austen's life as with some others that, we are looking at someone who is queer and that historians are just being like besties. So I guess I'll give you an example for you just because I think it's really funny, but also kind of sad, I guess, in the way that anything where we're erasing queer identities is sad, um, of a really, really classic, they were just best friends trope. So one of my favorite examples of this is Emily Dickinson and her sister-in-law, Susan Gilbert. Um, Now, I don't know if you guys have seen Dickinson, which is really excellent and gay, and obviously, like, is a bit anachronistic, like, very anachronistic, um, but, you know, very fun, very gay, love that. So Emily wrote hundreds of letters to Sue over her lifetime, and they were, yeah, really affectionate, very romantic, probably by our standards, but again, historians are like looking at them and just being like, yeah, I think that it makes sense that a 19th century poet would talk to her sister-in-law and be like, hey, are you coming home next Saturday and are you going to be mine, and would you like kiss me a little bit? And they're like, yeah, that really tracks. I feel like that is how we all talk to our sisters, right? And like, yeah, so, some people have been questioning whether their bond was like strictly platonic, but biographers and scholars are like, no, no, no. I mean, this is just the way that women in the 19th century express friendship. I mean, personally, I think saying to your bestie, I tore open your envelope and I licked the seal for a taste of you is a little bit gay, but I don't know, maybe that's just me reading into things. As always, I read this really great article by this woman called Kelsey Herx, who wrote a play about Mary Bennet being a lesbian. Love. And I will be going into that concept in my second video. But she wrote about this kind of patronizing consensus that the idea of like queer theory and queer analysis is some fad from the 70s, and that it has nothing to do with the reality of how life really was back in the good old days. I don't know, I find this really common in academia across the board, to be honest. This idea that queer readings of anything pre like 2000 is anachronistic and sort of offensive to the characters that you're talking about or the real people that you're talking about. But yeah, obviously we know queerness isn't ahistorical. There have been gay people, queer people, lesbians, asexuals, trans people for as long as there have been people. It's just that maybe they came under different labels or it looked a bit different. And obviously things were more hidden. So it makes sense that now that we're more out in the open and more accepted to a given value of that, that there's like that it becomes more obvious, and so that then, you know, straight people are like, oh my god, there's so many of them. They never used to exist before. It used to all be straight people and we just got married and had babies. That was the way the world worked. Now they all want to wear chokers and paint their nails and have strap-ons and stuff, and I don't understand it, and I just want to make a lasagna. That's how I imagine it must be to be a straight person, but I wouldn't know. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is that if I want to play lesbian dress-up dolls with my favorite 18th century characters and make them kiss a little, then that is my God-given right as a gay little nerd. And if you don't like that, homophobic. So chew on that, straights. So more seriously, which won't last, but more seriously for a moment, I think that, you know, if we look at Jane Austen's life and her writing and the choices that she made, both in her writing and her personal life, there's sort of spaces for a kind of queer story to emerge. And I'm not suggesting necessarily that she's done this on purpose, but because she focused so much of her attention in her writing on pulling apart women's spaces and their actions and their thoughts and their minds, then I think obviously just by design, there's going to be um, space for queer readings to emerge from that. And because I'm me, I'm going to look for those spaces and I'm going to say, yeah, they are all gay. They are all queer. And unfortunately, you can't stop me because I have a camera and I have the internet and I can upload my opinion. And I might be wrong, but I think I'm not. So chew on that, straights. Am I going to repeat that for the rest of the video? I hope not. It's annoying. So I'll stop. Or will I? No, I will. That's annoying. So for anybody who doesn't know who Jane Austen is, which if you don't, love the fact that you clicked on a video with a person that you don't know about a topic that you don't know anything about, because that shows a curious mind. And also maybe that you're into queer. So I think that we should be friends. Love you. Um, but if you don't know anything about her, she is a writer. She was writing in the 1800s. She was born in 1775 in England. She is known for kind of writing books about middle class society, particularly about women. She's very sharp social critiques of the people around her. She's very, very funny. Um, Mostly writes romances, kind of almost exclusively writes romances, but they're really, to my mind, social commentaries. Now, when I first started writing the script for this, I thought that I was going to very narrowly focus on queerness specifically. And instead, what I found is that it's hard to kind of unlink it from the thematic feminism, I guess, of Austen's work. And yeah, I mean, that has been kind of interesting because really where the queerness lies, I think, is around how she satirizes what it was to be a woman back in the Regency era and how difficult it was, the very limited choices that you had, and how marriage in particular is this prison, basically. Not that she would have said it necessarily in so many words, but the total lack of choice that a woman had, and how marriage was basically it. That's those are your options. You get married, and the man financially cares for you, but you become sort of relegated to his domain and property because he legally owns you when you marry him, which is cool. Love that. Or you don't get married and you remain a spinster like Jane Austen did for her entire life, but you have to provide for yourself, or you have to be lucky and have family who can financially support you. But it's not great. They're not great options, especially because I mean, obviously there's a class issue here because Jane Austen did come from a middle class family, and she's talking about middle class families in her work. So obviously, I'm not saying that this is like as rough as it gets, because like, let's be real, being a white middle class woman in England was not the worst option that you could have in the Regency era. But like, still not great. And this is the specific niche of intersectional feminism that we will be talking about today. Later on, I'll talk about other stuff, because I think that all of this is so important and interesting. But for now, we're talking very, very narrow. So don't get me wrong. I don't think that this is like, oh my God, poor middle class white lady, like how we rage, we rage. But it's still pretty shit. So like, let's talk about that. And more importantly, let's talk about how it left room for like gay shit, because, that's what I do. I like to talk about gay. So while she was alive, Jane had 4 books published. They were Pride and Prejudice.
She is tolerable, I suppose. But she's not handsome enough to tempt me.
Emma.
Hibbeth. Enough about Miss Charlton.
Mansfield Park.
Surely you and I are beyond speaking when words are clearly not enough.
And Sense and Sensibility.
What care I for coals when there is such a man?
You will care very much when your nose swells up.
You are right. Help me, Eleanor.
And then after she died, 2 of her books were published. These were Persuasion.
I am so ill. I can hardly speak. In fact, I do not think I was ever so ill in my life.
And Northanger Abbey.
I must give you one smirk, and then we can be rational again.
She also wrote a short epistolary novel called Lady Susan when she was in her 20s, I want to say. No, I think that's a lie. I think she was like 19 or 20 when she wrote it. And it was possibly based on something that she wrote when she was much younger. There's all of these really interesting kind of juvenilia, they're called, that she wrote when she was like literally a teenager. And there is, I feel like I'm getting this wrong, because I remember I read this and I was like, I'm gonna mess this up. I just know it. So she wrote something called Love and Friendship, which when she was like 14, and the movie that is based on Lady Susan, the epistolary novel that she wrote when she was like 19, 20, with Kate Beckinsale, which is excellent.
Lady Susan.
How dare you address me, sir? Be gone, or I will have you whipped.
Have you never met him?
No, I know him well. I would never speak to a stranger like that.
Is called Love and Friendship. And whether the reason it is called Love and Friendship is because Lady Susan was based on this earlier draft, which was called Love and Friendship, which she wrote when she was 14, or if they were just like, oh, that's a cool name, and let's just like change that title. That's possible. So why am I telling you this? I don't know. Good question. I just think it's interesting. And maybe I should have done more research on that to have answered that question. But instead, I put it to you. Do you know anything about that? Tell me what you think. What do you reckon? Now, the reason I bring this up is because the book Lady Susan, which isn't quite a novel, it's like a novella, I guess, it gives a kind of insight into Jane Austen's mind as a young woman, I think. It's about a woman called Lady Susan who is sort of the villain of the piece, but she's also the protagonist. And I think you could read it either way, I suppose, because it could be seen as Jane being like, this person sucks, and she, it's a moral lesson, don't be like Lady Susan. Or I possibly read it as maybe it was a bit of a satire, which we know that Jane is really good at, on the options that were available for a woman who was very intelligent and wanted to be able to use her mind and was capable of manipulating people, because she had the ability to read people well enough to do that. And she was a widow, but she was still very beautiful and still quite young. She was only 30. And so the plot of it is that she spends the book, she's been having an affair with a married man, and she spends the book kind of seeding chaos and trying to find herself a good, hot new young thing who is also very wealthy, who she can marry next. So she's kind of a cougar, she's kind of a gold digger. and her daughter, who she thinks of as kind of like a bit of an idiot, she is trying to marry off to some guy who she knows the daughter doesn't love or particularly like, but who is very wealthy. And in the end, she kind of gets her comeuppance, I suppose, by ending up marrying the young man who she had wanted her daughter to marry. But yeah, I guess my take on this is, and I'm willing to be told that I'm wrong, but I think, Lady Susan is a character who's confident, she's smart, she gets what she wants, and even in the end, her kind of losing is still a win, really. Um, and so, I think now we would look at a character like her, if she was a real person, in the modern era, and be like, boss babe, like go for it. And she is kind of perceived as, I think, quite masculine in the era that she's written, and I think that that's one of the issues that people have with her, and that's one of the reasons that she's seen as kind of a villainous character, is that she has taken on a kind of patriarchal role, and she has taken on a role that is seen as only belonging to a man. Um, and that's the wrong role for a woman to take, and so therefore she has to be punished. But yeah, I think it's possible that Austen wrote her as a kind of critique on the limitations of women's role in society, and the fact that even if you are extremely smart and even if you are willing to play the game, you are still going to be punished by society for doing that, and for basically just trying to live the best life that you can in the extreme circumstances that you find yourself in as a woman. Anyway, that's my take on it. I think it's worth mentioning Austen's place as a female novelist in that era, and how that was pretty unusual in some respects, or at least it wasn't necessarily something that was looked on with a lot of favor. The reputation of early female novelists was not good, to say the least. It was considered that, men were the only ones who could write good art, and so this sort of stuff that women were writing, necessarily, even despite the actual content, was all considered kind of fluffy, tropey, romantic formula fiction. And that if you wanted to write pure, elevated art, then it had to come from the minds of men. So, cool stuff. There's obviously a kind of traditional narrative that the English novel begins and kind of ends with men, but actually women have been writing from the start. There's Aphra Behn, who I would highly recommend you look up her work, very interesting, and just interesting in a historical context. Della Riviere Manley, they, were writing way before Austen's time, and then during the time that Austen was writing, there were a lot of female novelists, and they kind of dominated that sphere of, novel writing. I mean, there's downsides to all of that, because then the novel becomes seen as something that only women read, and it's like, it's the whole chick flick, chick lit thing of the early 2000s. That was how novels were seen in that era. And yeah, it was all kind of like semi pornographic formula fiction, as I say, which, then also leads on to why Austen, as with most female writers at the time, published all of her work anonymously. So actually none of her books had her name on them until after she died. Kind of an interesting story about when she sold Pride and Prejudice, and I don't know, maybe this happened a lot with manuscripts of the time, but it is just a real shame, because even though I did say that she came from a middle class family and things were not that terrible for her, it is still the truth that she relied on her brothers to finance her completely and to house her and her sister Cassandra, because if they hadn't, then they would have been. Uh, but the point is, when she sold Pride and Prejudice, she sold it on a contract. So she was just given a one-off payment of, I think it was £110, which is worth about £9,000 now. But it did extremely well, and if she had been given a commission for it, she would have made on commission the equivalent of 2 years of her father's annual salary, which sucks. So she never actually really made all of that much money on her books, and I think Mansfield Park she like lost money on. So, it wasn't necessarily something that was like, oh, she was extremely successful and rich from all of her writing. Actually, um, you know, never had her name on these things and didn't really make all that much money from it. So I think that kind of indicates a bit about what it was like to be a woman and to be a woman writer in that era. Bit, basically. What I'm saying is that marriage in the 18th and 19th century, it's not a personal choice, really. It's a social one, it's a financial one. And while men, as we know, have a lot of personal choice for what they can do in their lives, and they have a lot of freedom, women are pretty much guaranteed that their options are somewhere in the domestic sphere, and that's like pretty much it. That they're going to look after the house and raise babies and goodbye dreams. Now, I don't really think we can talk about all of this stuff without talking about Mary Wollstonecraft. She wrote one of the first, it's considered one of the first modern feminist treatises, even now, called A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And she argued that marriage is akin to slavery, basically, for women. And I mean, yeah, I mean, if we're talking about owning a person, like literally legally, when you got married in that era, you legally became the property of your husband. So that's pretty fucked up. And glad that doesn't happen anymore. Not that I'm planning on marrying a man anytime soon, but yeah. So she argued that marriage was something that really curtailed women's futures and that they basically became subject to their husband's will and that they were just like put back into this small domestic sphere and they no longer had any other options open to them, which pretty true. Yeah, I mean, I think Wollstonecraft's critiques illuminate the limitations that are placed on women's lives and ambitions and how they have their life kind of it prevents them from meaningful participation in society past their role as a wife or a mother. And yeah, I mean, I think that Austen, obviously she isn't like super obvious about this, but she approaches all of this in a kind of nuanced way where she shows that marriage is more often about survival than it is about a love match, and that you're really lucky if you manage to find true love in marriage as well. So I don't know. I think that there's definitely something to that. So Jane also faced some of her own kind of societal expectations around marriage as well. There is an interesting story about it seemed kind of funny at the time that when I first read this, and then I was like, oh, it's actually really sucks because it's such an indicator of like the expectations around marriage for women of the era. But anyway, luckily she was able to make this choice. But anyway, so uh, Jane was in her mid-20s, I'm assuming, and there was a guy who proposed to her, Henry Biggs Withers, I think his name was, and he was kind of known as, from the descriptions that I have read, he sounds like Mr. Collins. Basically, he was like not very handsome, a bit of a pain to be around, like kind. I think there's this one letter that says that nobody who had met him had enjoyed his company. So he proposes to her and Jane accepts. And I think what's implied is that she accepts because her family is in kind of a position. They've become quite poor after her father died. And this guy, Henry, is well off and it would be like a really good financial match for the family. And so she says yes, even though it would probably be like really crap to get married to this guy. And then the next morning, she's like clearly thought over it and she comes back and she tells him, like, no, I can't marry you. Which, yeah, when I first read this, I was like, I only saw the kind of like highlights of this and was like, oh my God, accept a accept a marriage proposal. And then the next morning be like, bye. Queen behavior, love that. But yeah, obviously the reality of like why it was done is kind of like more, because it really implies, you know, the pressure from her family to like care for them through the only way that you can, which is a marriage, which sucks. Anyway, I'm really glad that she said no, and I think that it's really interesting that then, yeah, the rest of her life she continued to live with her sister Cassandra, and apparently spent a lot of time trying to cultivate a sort of like feminist, not a feminist commune, but a community of women. Um, and you know, wanted to have, there's all of these really interesting things about um I think there's an indication that she and her mum did not get along. But so she and Cassandra lived together for a long time, her and her sister, and at various points, she, Cassandra, and another woman, Martha Lloyd, who she was really good friends with, also lived together for like a number of years. Um, and what they seemed to both kind of want was for all three of them to live together away from the mother, and to also bring in other women and basically have this like community of like-minded women, writers, just like all living together and having the best fucking time. And unfortunately, they were kind of thwarted by that and ended up living with the mother again in a house, I think, as if I am getting this right, because there's a lot of biography to go through and different kind of sources, but I think the brother, one of Jane and Cassandra's brothers, bought a house for them, or had a house for them in Chawton, where they eventually all lived. And I think that the reason that they were sort of thwarted in all of this was because Chawton was like the best option for them. Anyway, but we'll go into all of that later. I just think that that is an interesting little sidebar. So yeah, I guess it makes sense that in an environment like this, the idea of romance and love within marriage is kind of a luxury that few women could really afford. And yeah, I mean, like Austen remained unmarried for her entire life, so I guess, well, I mean, we don't know why. We can make some assumptions. I'm certainly going to be making very many, but you know, it at the very least, we know that she had a kind of a harder time of that, or at least there was a sort of um, you know, she had to navigate a world which was not particularly kind to unmarried women, and that she didn't have that many choices open to her as an unmarried woman. Okay, I think my camera was drooping. Anyway, uh, yeah, I think we might look at the fact that she remained unmarried for her entire life and be like, oh my god, poor thing, she probably was so lonely and, you know, never found love or whatever, which, however, I will be arguing that maybe she did find love just outside of the bonds of heterosexual marriage. Um, but I think even if she didn't, maybe she was straight. I don't know. Who am I to say? I am to say that I don't think that she was, but I, you know, maybe she was. Maybe she's straight. The fact was that I don't think she was lonely. I think that she, like probably a lot of women and possibly a lot of married women as well, because, you know, being married certainly doesn't mean that you are going to have great deep emotional connection with your husband. God forbid. um I hope it for you, for the straights, but maybe you don't, especially back then when, you know, people aren't necessarily going like, oh, let me marry this man that I love so much. Sometimes it's just like, let me marry this man because I want to be able to like have a house. um so, you know, what I'm saying is that the way that like women probably mostly got their deep emotional connections was from other women. And that makes sense because, you know, isn't that also the case today? I certainly experienced that, you know, even amongst my straight friends. I think the bonds that we have with each other are often like so strong. And, you know, I'm not going to speak for other women in my life. But I know that for me, the friendships that I have with other women are so deeply important to me. And often like the great loves of my life, whether they're romantic or not. And I mean, often not. Like those amazing friendships that you have with other women where they stay with you for years and years and years. I mean, I have been like so privileged to have friendships with women that have lasted I mean, my whole life, which is like, what a joy. Um, yeah, I mean, I've been friends with women who are like my sisters, even though we have no biological relation, but we have just known each other since we were babies. And like, how lucky am I to have that experience with those beautiful women? And oh my God, I'm gonna cry. The like, yeah, and then the women who have come into my life later on. I mean, I I have some beautiful friends who I met even just in high school, but now because I'm an old crone, we have been friends for like, I don't even want to say how many years, but lot of years. Uh, Women who I met at university, who I still am friends with, women who I met when I was living overseas, who I'm still like so fucking tight with. And like, what a huge privilege and a joy to have those sorts of relationships that are like not uh they're not relegated to some kind of like sexual and romantic thing. They're so deep and wonderful and fulfilling without any of that. And I don't know, maybe sometimes a little bit of that, but that is not the most important thing. It's the fact that you have these people who understand you, and they just get you to such a deep, deep level. And also, I should point out too, because this could come off a little bit turfy, me just saying, the women in my life, but that includes some wonderful trans women in my life. That includes non-binary people in my life. I even have a couple of wonderful male friends, which shocked even me. I spent a lot of my 20s like kind of specifically making a choice not to be friends with men, and so I've been quite lucky and um, yeah, very fortunate, I think, to have met some really, really beautiful men in the last couple of years who are very wonderful friends. But this is not about them. So, um, I just think that how wonderful to have these female friendships. So my camera died in the middle of making that, which is why it is so nighttime right now. And I think that maybe that is a sign that I should stop going on long rants about my own personal life. But it was relevant, so I'm going to keep it in. Anyway, love and friendship. So Jane has a number of siblings, but her elder sister Cassandra is the one that she's tightest with, and they lived together for up until Jane died. Uh, Possibly off and on, I couldn't see. There seemed to be a period where there were 4 years where they didn't seem to communicate, I think was the thing that happened. Or there was like a 4-year period where there's no letters from Jane to anyone, or maybe just from Jane to Cassandra. Um, and the reason for this is because, well, I mean, I don't know the reason why there's this 4-year period, but the reason that we don't have any letters is that Cassandra burnt like all of the letters that she deemed too sort of intimate or revealing after Jane died. Um, so I know that there was something about this 4-year period. She burnt like all of the letters between them. So clearly something happened. Like maybe they were arguing or something was going on. Because she even, I mean, she apparently would burn anything that was like talking about family illnesses, anything where Jane kind of made like a rude comment about a family member, that kind of thing. She would burn a lot of it. Um, and I have some beef with Cassandra about that, because it's like such a shame that we just have like these huge holes in the like availability of like information about like who Jane was, because it's just like all just ripped to pieces and then like put in a bonfire by Cassandra, because she was like, I just think this is too private. And like, okay, whatever, it's like somebody's private life. But yeah, it wasn't like Jane herself necessarily, I mean, we don't know, I guess, but it wasn't like Jane herself necessarily was the one to be like, please burn all of my letters, in the same way that I would maybe be like, please burn my laptop so nobody can see the things that I searched. And oh god, they're on like the Chrome cloud along with my bookmarks. This is terrible. I need to like figure something else out about that, because it's just like, oof, the mortification. Anyway, so she burnt everything. That really sucks. But it does mean that there's this kind of like air of mystery around Jane's relationships, and these sort of holes that we have in what we might have known about Jane's life. And that is interesting because, you know, how I love a mystery. We all love a good fucking mystery. And if I may, I will imply very heavily that anything that is lost must indeed be gay. So, you know, come with me on that journey if you will. And I mean, you're here in this video, so you're going to have to. Sorry. Now, my extremely smart friend recommended a great book to me when she read through my script, which was very nice of her, by Sharon Marcus, called Between Women, which is actually about 19th century women rather than 18th century, but it still, I think, relates in a way that, you know, makes a lot of sense. So Marcus kind of argues that the way that we look at women as so-called relative creatures, that is like relative to men, means that we have a very narrow focus on the way that we see them, which is very binary. It's kind of men versus women, heterosexual versus homosexual, so on. Yeah, and that really limits our understandings of gender and kinship and sexuality. And what she kind of argues is that concepts like marriage and sexuality are much broader than these binary options of, you know, heterosexuality, homosexuality, men versus women. And that we have kind of limited our understandings of what people's experiences of these might have been like, and that they're much broader than we realize. I mean, there's a really interesting thing in there about how in the Victorian era, women might have experienced marriage between each other, and, you know, someone says the idea of marriage between women is not entirely preposterous, which, what a glowing recommendation that is. She also argues that lesbian lives are kind of best understood within the general history of women rather than as this like very narrow niche interest, and even that heterosexual women's lives can't be uncovered properly without thinking of them in reference to the friendships that they had with other women, like we discussed earlier, how important that is to women's lives is other women, and how they interact with female objects of desire, which, you know, love that. Don't really know what that means, to be perfectly honest. I say it out loud and then I'm like, I mean, I know how I relate to female objects of desire, but what do we mean by that in terms of heterosexual women? I will come back to this, or maybe I won't, but I'm just going to leave it there. And you guys, maybe you comment. What do you think? What do you think that means? Because apparently I'm not smart enough at 10 o'clock at night. So, and so what she's kind of suggesting is that this apparitional idea of the lesbian maybe allowed for a broader understanding of sexuality pre pre the idea of like strict binary homosexuality, heterosexuality. So there's kind of something quite interesting in the idea that you know, before the label of lesbian carried such a sort of modern stigma and association and fear, maybe there was more fluidity in female relationships where they were allowed to kind of express affection and uh, desire and um, intimacy in ways that weren't going to be labeled as anything, because the label sort of wasn't there in the same way. And so, yeah, it's kind of interesting to think that maybe there was maybe some more interesting aspects of queerness that could be explored historically, that we will never really understand, because it's too, we've put too much of a binary on it. Um, and I mean, obviously, there's downsides to all of that. So I don't know if it's necessarily like something that would be, I'm not hugely wanting to go back to the Regency era and be like, oh my God, please, I want to experience being a lesbian in a time where I would probably be killed for it. But give me some of that sweet, sweet mutton chop lovin', because I will have to marry a man because look, let's be realistic. I am not going to be coming from a wealthy family. And I guess even if I did, maybe the expectation would be that I would have to get married anyways. So, like, girl, I am going to be putting my hands down titty gowns and, kissing ladies in carriages. I mean, it sounds quite good, to be honest, but all behind closed doors. But I guess what I'm saying is, I do want to go back to the Regency era, but just for a short period. I don't know. I kind of imagine myself. I'm thinking about when I was like 15 and I worked at a bookshop and I read these like uh series of books that were about female spies in the Regency era, and they were really good, kind of sexy. They were heterosexual romances, which like, ugh, but they were pretty sexy. What were they called? Pink Carnation, I think, was one of them. I'll have to go back and read them because anyway, they were like very clearly, written by someone who loved Jane Austen. Um, and all I'm thinking about is this one scene where one of the girls is like, the main character is like in a rowboat and she's like escaping from something because she was a spy on some dangerous mission. And anyway, I'm pretty sure she gets in the boat by the guy who is her love interest, uh, or it or something. And I'm just imagining that, like, maybe I could become a lady spy and do that, but with a lady who is also a lady spy, maybe. And I think I have always wanted to go back in time, at least for like a little section, a little period. Um, that's just some history related humor for you. You're welcome. Anyway, let's move on. I think this bit doesn't really work. Let's talk about Cassandra. So Cassandra is, as I say, Jane's sister. And I would just like to point out, first of all, when I first started reading about Cassandra, I didn't totally know like huge amount of detail about Jane Austen's life, to be perfectly honest. And I thought that she was maybe like Jane's sister-in-law because y'all know about those lesbians and their sisters-in-law, like Emily Dickinson. Hello. Um, but it turns out they are actually biologically related. So I just want to like forward project and be like, I don't actually think that they boinked. But there's going to be some stuff where I intimate that. Not because I didn't know that they were biological sisters, but just because I read this article, which I'm going to be pulling quotes from like no tomorrow, because it's really interesting. And there's some kind of like stuff in it which like implies some things, even though later the author of the article was like, I have been grossly misinterpreted and I did not ever say that Jane either was a lesbian or boinked her sister, because I don't think that she even had sex with anybody, let alone her sister. But let's be real. I think that actually, if you read back over that article, it's like, I think she did think she was making some implications. Um, anyway, incest allegations out of the way. And to be fair, I do actually think it's a little bit weird that Jane and Cassandra apparently slept in the same bed as adult spinsters for like a good chunk of time. And there's I mean, I don't know, like, I suppose I don't have sisters who are like a similar age to me. But I guess I mean there's nothing wrong with like sleeping in the same bed as your sister, but like not for like life. I guess that's what's weird to me. Like they were just sleeping in the same bed like forever? Did they not have two beds? And there's this kind of interesting line that Jane, I mean it's kind of cute, I guess. It's a bit weird, but she is like traveling somewhere and she sends a letter back to Cassandra and she's like, I like miss the fact that you're like not here in bed with me and we can't cuddle and I'm like cold and stuff. And I'm like, but it's kind of cute, but it's a bit weird. So, just a thought. But I don't. Anyway, I'm not. Incest allegations out of the way. I don't think that she actually had sex with her sister, but I do think it's a bit weird. It's a little weird. Let's be real. Anyway, so this article that I'm talking about is by a person called Terry Castle, and she wrote this in 95 in the London Review of Books, and it was called "Was Jane Austen Gay?" And I think that the London Review of Books actually like titled it themselves without asking Castle for permission, and it was pretty clearly done to like stir up some controversy, which they definitely did. The response was, I think, probably more than they were expecting. There were a lot of people who were like, "Oh my god, how dare you sully the shades of Pemberley with your smutty filth, you disgusting man," because everybody thought that because Terry is like obviously a name that could be perceived as masculine, that Terry was just like a gross dude who was like, writing out his like sordid, kinky fan fiction about Cassandra and Jane. So everyone was like, how dare you? Jane Austen is a pristine heterosexual who would never touch her sister with a barge pole, you disgusting man. And Terry Castle was like, I've been misinterpreted. But anyway, I do think that it is kind of interesting to think about the fact that like it wasn't just like the squeamishness about this article was not restricted solely to the incest allegations. It was like very much about the idea that Jane Austen could ever be considered queer as well. So I think there's this like puritanical squeamishness around the concept of like queering a character or a person in any way that I find really and boring and uncurious, especially because, like, let me remind you, we don't actually know either way anything about Jane Austen. We don't know whether she was straight, we don't know whether she was gay, we don't know anything. All we know is that she never married. All we know is that she spent the majority of her time surrounded by women. All we know is that Cassandra burnt a lot of her letters to a particular woman who I will be talking about in a second. All we know is that she was extremely close friends with other women who also never married, and, had a live in friend who, like, they were extremely close. Um, I just think it's like it's weird that we have this response to a situation about a historical person who we don't know specific details about. We don't know their intimate life. We don't know the realities of the inside of their mind and the like decisions that they made, and we don't know who they wanted to have sex with. I mean, yeah, we're just like looking at the evidence of her life or the lack of evidence in her life and being like, that to me is a straight person beyond reproach, because I cannot imagine that anybody could possibly be gay unless I see with my own two eyes that they are knee deep in the passenger seat and they're eating her out. And is it casual now? You know? I just think it's boring and uncurious. And it's just like too straight coded for me to even consider that someone is like, looking at a life that we don't fully understand, that is a kind of a mystery, and being like, I only see the straights. I can see no more. And you're gross for even pointing out the idea that something could have been different to that. So, I just want to say, shut up. And I will do whatever I like. So, and personally, I think it's homophobic, not because of like, normal homophobia reasons, although it is a little bit that, but also because it implies that I'm wrong about something, and that is true homophobia. Gross. And I think there's like a pretty common approach in academia to defend the literary greats from accusations of queerness by saying that to call them queer is anachronistic and that we're putting like a modern lens on things. And I just want to say to that if that is the case, then is it also not anachronistic to say that they are straight? Because all of it is through our modern lens. We are all of us are looking at these things through our own set of values, through our own set of experience. And realistically, like I say, we don't know anything specific enough. I think, yeah, this idea that our kind of modern framework of straightness should also be applied to historical figures um, is just as much of an imposition of our modern lens as the idea that we would be like, if Jane Austen was here in the modern era, then she would wear Doc Martens and have a little moleskin book, and she would be maybe on field every now and then being like, just looking for the vegan cat lady of my dreams. You know? It's all relative. So back to Cassandra. Terry Castle points out in her article that the only surviving images that we have of Jane are the bad portraits that Cassandra drew of her, which I think is pretty cute, to be perfectly honest. The idea that we have, you know, no other idea of this like huge historical figure, because of obviously this is all pre-photography, um, who like looms large in all of our imaginations, but the only way that we have to see her through the years is these like bad little drawings done by her sister, um, where she kind of like looks a little bit lopsided and stuff, but she was drawn because she was loved, which I think is very sweet. And Terry, my best friend Terry, brings up that there's also this kind of interesting phenomenon in Austen's writing that almost all of them either have a very important sisterly relationship either already in like the beginning of the book, or there's a kind of idea that by the end of it, one of the great joys in the relationship is that it brings the protagonist closer to a kind of beloved sister-in-law. So there's all these like really interesting sisterly relationships in that, which obviously goes to show that her relationship with Cassandra, which I mean we know just given all the letters that we do still have and the fact that we know that they lived together for so long, we know that they did have an extremely close relationship. So it's obviously very, very important to Jane. Um, but yeah, I mean, it's very interesting to think about like the relationship between Eleanor and Marianne in Sense and Sensibility. Obviously, one of the most famous, Jane and Lizzie, and you know, then we also have like even the idea of, I mean, it's not so much of a like strong thing, but I think there's still even an indication of it that in Pride and Prejudice, um, Lizzie sees Georgiana Darcy as this kind of sweet could be sister, and even becomes a little defensive of her um, before she and Darcy marry. And so there's kind of, yeah, a lovely thing that marrying Darcy also brings her closer to this new little sister, who, I mean, you know, there could then be an argument about is Georgiana kind of just a stand-in for a better little sister than Kitty and Lydia and Mary, which that sucks for those little sisters. But I mean, it's true. Georgiana is, um, as we know, sweet and accomplished and probably a little bit less trouble. Although I suppose she's still got the whole Wickham deal, so I don't know. You know, maybe maybe little sisters are just doomed to be trouble. Yeah, so I think it's kind of interesting to think about how the sisterly bond is like such an important recurring theme in Austen's work, and how you can almost see it as like um, it's often like a stronger bond than the ones with the male love interest. I mean, obviously there's still romances, but um, I mean, you think about like Lizzie and Jane. I mean, they Lizzie's love for Jane is like so crazily, you know, off the chain. Um, and one of the main reasons that she initially is like you to Darcy is because she feels that he had like ruined the happiness of her most beloved sister. Um, and you know, if she had found out that that was true, there's no way, even if Darcy had been, I mean, I guess the reasoning is that, you know, Darcy is a better person than that, but if you know, if everything had gone the way it had, but he had not fixed things between Jane and Bingley, and if he had not apologized for that, then I don't think that she would have ever married him. I think that she would have been too much like, no, you fucked over my sister, and that's something I can never abide. So there's something kind of interesting in that for sure. So when we look at some of the surviving letters that Jane wrote, I think it's really interesting to think about how she describes the people around her. She mostly seems to think that men are insignificant. They don't really come up very often in her letters, and if they do, they're not described in much detail. But the women in her letters are like described in loving detail. They're so endlessly fascinating to her. We look at, their clothes, their manners, their uh the way they talk, their mannerisms, um their relationships with others. I mean, it's just all so deep, the way that she talks about women. Then there's kind of a like a homophilic fascination with women, I think. So there's some quotes from her letters which I think are really lovely. She writes of a Mrs. Powlett in 1801 that she was at once expensively and nakedly dressed, and that we have had the satisfaction of estimating her lace and muslin. Of a Mrs. and Miss Holder, it is the fashion to think them most detestable, but their gowns look so white and so nice that I cannot utterly abhor them. And of someone else she says, Miss looked very handsome, but I prefer her little smiling, flirting sister Julia. And a last one where she says, I admire the sagacity and taste of Miss Charlotte Williams. Those large dark eyes suit her very well. I will compliment her by naming a heroine after her. So yeah, I mean, I think it's really obvious that she finds women really fascinating, and she talks about their bodies in a really interesting way. They're kind of there to be dissected and examined and like looked at and discussed, which, pretty gay if you ask me, which you didn't, but I am here to tell you that I think that. So now, I think most people, when they talk about Jane Austen's close friendships, will usually talk about Martha Lloyd, who I did mention. So she and Jane and Cassandra lived together for many years. But I don't want to talk about her today. I want to talk about a woman called Anne Sharp, who was the governess to one of Jane's nieces, Fanny. And she and Jane became friends, probably while Anne was a governess. And then they remained friends until Jane died. So Anne Sharp is kind of a hard person to pin down historically. I don't think we have a huge amount of detail on her. There's also some kind of confusing stuff where some writers seem to think that the Miss Anne Sharp, who was a governess, couldn't possibly have been the Miss Sharp who Jane writes about in her letters. And I don't really know. I think that mm, it just seems weird to me that if we have these two people who we know that Jane was very close to a Miss Sharp, and we know that the timing kind of works out, I don't really understand why historians don't think that they would be the same person, unless there's some kind of like classist thing about being like, oh, Jane wouldn't possibly have been friends with a governess, ew. Um, which I kind of lean towards a little bit, but like, I don't know whether that's true or not. Maybe there's more reasons than I know. So most of the information that we have about Anne is through Fanny's diaries. So Fanny was 11 when Anne first turned up at Godmersham, and she seemed to be someone who Fanny loved a lot. They like spent the first 6 months having a grand old time, going on walks, doing lessons. And what I think is very cute is apparently for that first 6 months, Anne Sharp was working on a play which she then put on with the children. And there's some evidence that Jane and Cassandra were visiting Godmersham at the time. And there's talk about, I don't know, I kind of got a few different versions of this, so I don't know if this is totally true, because some people say that Jane couldn't have possibly been visiting at the same time that Anne um, was a governess at Godmersham. But then there's another thing that I read where it was like really clear that Jane was there and like put on the play with Anne. So I don't know which is true, but I'm going to believe that she was there and put on the play with her and that that's where they met. Especially because it's really cute to imagine that Anne's also a writer, which is lovely, and that they put on this play and that they're doing this all for the servants with all the children, um, and yeah, playing their parts together. And apparently they like did a Scottish reel as well, so there's like music playing and stuff. Very very cute. What a little meet cute! Can you imagine? That to me says lesbians, because the lesbians love a meet cute. Now, kind of important to note, because this is the reason that Anne eventually leaves, is that she seemed to have some kind of like bouts of bad health. So early on in that 6 months, Fanny writes in her diary that she has like this bout of fainting and goes very grey and passes out or something, and that like doctors are called and stuff. So not great. But the reason that that is important as well is because apparently there was some indication that Fanny's mother did not like it when any of the servants got sick, and would often just like let them go. And uh, Anne got like quite sick a little bit later, and had to have like some doctor come in, and then they were like some quack doctor who like sewed a blister onto like Anne's neck. I don't know what that means, but it sounds fucking gross. And I can't imagine that it helped whatever she was going through. And it didn't, because he was a quack. So she got like more sick, and then eventually, in classic middle class person who owns servants kind of fashion, the mum was like, I'm over this, like, bye. So she left. And I think at the time Jane and Cassandra were living in a like much smaller house, because there was an indication that they could have and maybe wanted to help Anne out with a place to live, but they didn't have enough space, so so they couldn't offer that. But Anne ended up becoming a governess somewhere else, and their friendship continued. So the other thing that makes me think it's definitely the same Anne is that even if the play situation didn't happen, like if they didn't meet then, which now I'm like, I think that that does make the most sense. I don't know why this would have been brought up if that wasn't true. Um, but even if that isn't the case, Fanny's diaries also indicate a period where, like during this, before she gets let go, Anne is away from the house for about a month. And it lines up with the period of time where Jane and Cassandra were moving house, which was just after their father died. And because life is misery, they had to move into smaller lodgings because they couldn't afford anything else. Um, and so there's an indication that it would have made sense that Jane and Cassandra's brother, Fanny's dad, might have sent Anne to help them with the move, and that she would have stayed with them for that month. Which I was like, this to me, I'm like, I think this is where the friendship and possibly more began. Now, I have some thoughts about what happened when they were together for that month. And the thoughts are that I maybe wrote some mental fan fiction about it. And I was just thinking about how cute it would have been after they'd had their initial meet cute of like putting on plays together for the kids, and that then they're like living in the same house together, and maybe they're like talking about their writing, and like maybe they're having breakfast together in the sunshine, and they're like, I mean, it's England though, so probably not that sunny, but it's fan fiction. So they're like having their beautiful breakfast together, and they're being like, pass the cream, and the other person is like, I'm creaming. And then maybe they're like going into each other's rooms, and they're only wearing their chemises, and maybe they like dance like in the Anya Taylor-Joy Emma, and like maybe they help each other to dress, and like maybe they have to share a bed because there's only one bed, because we know that Jane is into that. and maybe sometimes their like hands touch while they go for like long walks, and maybe they like kiss a little sometimes, and maybe they're like, hey, we should be in love, and we should start a feminist commune, and I want to spend the rest of my life with you. And I think that that is what happened. And you know what? I have historical proof for it. And the proof is that I want it to have happened. Um, so, source, trust me. Anyway, we do know that Anne read Jane's work. Jane would like send her work to Anne all the time. And that she really liked everything that she wrote. I really liked this, that so the reason that we know stuff is, because bloody Cassandra burnt all of her letters. We know a lot of this because Jane like wrote down sections of the letters that she had received from Anne, where she was like, oh, so this is the thing that you had said about Pride and Prejudice, so like let me write it down. Like, and I'm just like, ugh, it's to me that we don't have the entire letter, but like we have these sections, which is really nice. Anyway, nothing like huge, but it's only the bits about what she had said about the writing. But I still think that that's great. So what we do know is that she loved Pride and Prejudice. She thought Mansfield Park was a bit iffy, I think, but still like well written, and she felt like Emma was like kind of somewhere in the middle. So they did keep up like a regular correspondence, we do know that, and Jane invited her to come and stay a number of times, and I think that she succeeded a few times, which is nice, and I continue to write my fan fiction about that. There's a kind of cute story about how Jane was like very concerned about Anne's situation, and so like she kind of worried about her a lot, I think, from what we know. And there's this one situation where Anne was governess to a new family, and Jane wrote this letter not to Anne, but I'm not sure to who, where she expressed a wish that the widowed father of this child would fall in love with Anne and marry her. And she's like, oh my god, please, like I would love you so much, Sir William, if you just fell in love with Anne. And there's kind of this like, well, I can't imagine why you wouldn't fall in love with her. She's like so sexy and beautiful and funny and smart and cool. Obviously you would. And unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, Sir William did not oblige, and they did not get married. And so, thwarted again, but maybe for the best. So when Jane and Cassandra and their mother had moved to that big old house in Chawton that the brother had gotten for them, Anne did come and visit. So this is while Austen was working on Pride and Prejudice. Like the only thing I really know about that trip is that apparently Anne came to visit after some opposition from Cassandra. So Cassandra was not a fan of Anne. She did not like their friendship. It's not entirely clear why, but she certainly didn't. And this idea that she was like opposed to Anne coming to visit is interesting. And then in the meantime, I think it's quite nice. Jane sent Anne a presentation copy of Emma, which was apparently pretty unusual, or like a bit of a mark of her affection because there weren't very many copies. And as a similar sign of Anne's affection for Jane, she had it bound in calfskin, and I just think that that is really sweet and gay. Also, some historians talk about the fact that there's some evidence that Mrs. Weston in Emma is based on Anne. And I think that if that is true, then that's like such an indicator of what Jane thought of Anne. Like she clearly loved her a lot, because I mean, if you think about how Emma thinks about Mrs. Weston, she's like, she's the best, love her so much, she's like the queen of my heart. And I mean, it also makes sense because she's a governess, so I think there's like parallels. It makes sense that she would be based on Anne. But I think, yeah, such an indicator, given that we don't have a lot of information about what Jane really thought of Anne, because of all of those goddamn letters that got burnt. Then this is a little sprinkling of something. So, like I'm saying, Cassandra is an interesting one, and I think that the fact that she doesn't like Anne, to me, indicates something as well. I mean, maybe just that she just doesn't like her for whatever reason, but um as I said earlier, Cassandra burnt all of Jane's letters after she died that she considered to be too intimate, too revealing, blah blah blah. What I find really interesting and telling is that Jane did have quite a number of female friends, as I say, and Martha Lloyd, as I'm saying, as I said, considered by many to be one of her closest friends. There's a lot of remaining letters between Jane and Martha, and Jane and her other female friends, Jane and Cassandra, that are clearly not considered, too telling. Jane and Anne were friends for a pretty good chunk of time. Jane's a big letter writer. There would have been a lot of letters. That's so much information that could have been gleaned from that. So I'm still hateful against Cassandra. Why? But anyway, what I think is interesting is, so there's still these snippety letters from and to Jane to other people. But Cassandra burnt every single one of Jane's letters to Anne and Anne's letters to Jane. And I think it indicates something. I mean, it seems to me if the reason that you're burning all of these letters is because you think that they're too revealing and too intimate, then what do you think specifically is too intimate and revealing about all of the letters to this person? To me, that seems to imply that there's something that you're hiding there. And I personally think that what they are hiding is a secret lesbian romance. And I will not take questions at this time because I think I'm correct. So that's the end of the story. So as I've said a million times, Cassandra burnt all of her letters. The only one, we have one remaining letter that is from Jane to Anne. It was written on her deathbed a couple of weeks before she died, and it is addressed, "My dearest Anne." Ugh, heartbreaking. They're lesbians, Your Honor. I have no more further to say. Well, I do actually have further to say, but I rest my case. I don't rest my case because I actually have more to say. Here is one of my final pieces of evidence for you. So Cassandra actually wrote a letter to Anne. This was after Jane had died, and she encloses in it a lock of Jane's hair, which Anne had requested, and a couple of other things, a bodkin, which couldn't find anybody. Nobody seemed to know what it was. Maybe something for sewing or something that you hung on your shirt or something. Anyway, a few nice little things to remember Jane by after she died. And along with it, she sends a letter, and it is bitchy. So Cassandra's letter to Anne reads thus: "My dear Miss Sharp, I have great pleasure in sending you the lock of hair you wish for, and add a pair of clasps which he sometimes wore, and a small bodkin which he had had in constant use for more than 20 years. I know how these articles, trifling as they are, will be valued by you, and I am very sure that if she is now conscious of what is passing on earth, it gives her pleasure they should be so disposed of. I am quite well in health, and mother is very tolerably so, and I am much more tranquil than with your ardent feelings you could possibly suppose. What I have lost, no one but myself can know. You are not ignorant of her merits, but who can judge how I estimated them? God's will be done. I have been able to say so all along. I thank God that I have. If anything should ever bring you into attainable distance from me, we must meet, my dear Miss Sharp. Believe me very truly, your affectionate friend." Now, on the surface, that seems like a nice enough letter, and obviously I have given inflection to the pieces that I think are sort of sarcastic or a bit kind of dickish. But I will go into why I think so. And also, this is not just me. I have been reading this, and even people who do not necessarily think that they are lesbians agree with me that this letter is pointy. at the very least. So first of all, there's the your ardent feelings line, which do not get me started. I mean, do get me started because that's why we're here. But first of all, that seems very telling to me. You're just going to go and say that someone has ardent feelings for Jane Austen and you're not going to tell me that they're a lesbian? I mean, but also, I think, let me come down from my gay high, but it's also like it really reads as a bit of a like admonishment, being like the way that you feel is like you're so passionate and you've got such big emotions and I hate it. And you should be more like me, who is more demure. I mean, it's the whole Sense and Sensibility thing, right? I feel like she is making a bit of a dig. But it's also, I mean, I cannot get past your ardent feelings. That's such specific wording. Mm. Then I think the kind of saying like, one, it's like than you could possibly suppose, and then also being like basically saying you don't understand how I'm feeling, and actually nobody else understands how I'm feeling because we had this bond that was like different to everybody else. Like it's a bit of a dig. Like I think it's important to note the fact that this is not just like a normal letter just like in the kind of course of things. Like she's not just being a bitch out of nowhere. Her sister has died. She is sending a letter to a dear friend whose dear friend has died. Like that is a weird time to be like, I'm going to tell you I don't like you and I don't like the way that you dealt with my sister, and actually I don't like the fact that you had this close relationship and I'm a bit jealous. Like it's weird. So clearly there's some big feelings. But yeah, like what a time to be alive. What a time to be saying these things to someone. Like, oh, rough. Anyway, also, I just love the final point of being like, if you find yourself near me, you can totally drop by, but I am not going to travel to see you. Let's be real. Like, it's just, mwah, so mean. Um, and you know what? Look, as much beef as I have with Cassandra, I will say that girl is a Scorpio, like me. And she can hold a grudge because she's like, my sister may be dead, but right now, I got some to say to you. And I just like, look, one, this whole letter is great because I feel like it, it gives me more evidence of the lesbianism, but also like you gotta respect someone who like stands on business. So I gotta respect her for that. I feel like Cassandra obviously had some complicated feelings about Anne. I think I read somewhere that Jane very rarely used the address my dearest blah, so the fact that she used that for Anne, um I think indicates a closeness that maybe Cassandra felt intimidated by. And obviously, given how incredibly close the two of them were, Jane and Cassandra as sisters, maybe she felt like there was, something going on that disrupted that in some way and made her feel unsure. And, I just think it's interesting because usually I feel like as a family member, you wouldn't feel that way about just like to like the friend of your sister. I feel like you wouldn't be like, oh my god, this like friend is taking up so much of my sister's time, and like they're so close. But maybe if you were like extremely close as sisters and then they had a lover and they like had this whole different bond that you could just like never get close to because like you're not having sex with your sister, like I could understand there being a bit of a like, well, I can't ever give you that. I mean, that is a little bit weird to be thinking about a sibling, but like, it feels if you have that kind of like intimacy with a sibling, maybe, and like, you live together and whatever. I don't know. As I say this, I'm a bit like, it was a bit gross. But like, yeah, maybe that is it. I mean, because the friendship, otherwise it's just like, dude, Cassandra, like chill. But in this case, I'm like, yeah, if they were lovers, And also, you know, Cassandra clearly didn't approve of her from the beginning. Um, and maybe that was to do with the class thing as well. But, like, you know, if she's like, oh, you have this working class girlfriend and you want to hang out with her all the time. And I just like, I just hate it. And I don't like it at all. And even now my sister's dead, I'm gonna be really mad about it. My final piece of evidence that I lay before you is that Anne, like Jane, never married. And I believe it. Anyway, I'm one final thing. Now, like I said before, we can't know anything for sure about Jane. We just don't have enough evidence. But we do know that she never married, although that, you know, even if she had, maybe that wouldn't really have proven anything. But what we do know is that we have kind of some doubts. We have some gaps. And as Claudia L. Johnson says in The Divine Miss Jane, these doubts about her sexuality have over the years come out as ideas around her maybe being asexual, a lesbian, or just frigid. Now, I think that there definitely could be an argument for her being asexual. Um, I mean, I prefer the idea that she's a lesbian just because, you know, that resonates with me the most. But definitely, yeah, I think that there's definitely an argument that she could have been asexual and just like not interested in any of it. And I will be discussing in the second video about Charlotte Lucas in that sense, and I think that that will be really interesting. Now, I do think the like frigidity argument is super interesting because like really it's just a like shitty version of the asexuality argument, I think. Now, Charlotte Bronte certainly seemed to think that Jane was frigid. Yeah, she certainly wasn't an ally about it, whatever way she thought, that's for sure. She was not a huge fan of Jane Austen. She wrote like a number of letters that I was able to find where she talked about Jane. Either usually it was somebody else asking her like what she thought of Jane Austen's writing or if she would recommend her or anything like that. And she basically was like, no, she sucks. And look, obviously not everybody's for everybody, but I do think it's kind of interesting to note that when I had a look at the other people who she was like, you must read these people, these are the canon, these are the people who are like life changing, it was pretty much all men. So I'm a big fan of Charlotte Bronte. I love Jane Eyre. But I will say I couldn't help but think, is there some internalized misogyny in your reaction to Jane Austen? Quite possibly. One of her major points was she wrote that, you know, Jane Austen did a very good job of talking about the kind of surface lives of the genteel Englishman, but what throbs underneath, what the blood runs through, she knows nothing about it. So obviously she's like, Jane Austen does not fuck, she's a virgin. And look, you know, argument can be made. But personally, I think that, you know, it's just a taste thing. Not everybody wants to write stories about men who hang out in manor houses with their wife locked up in the attic. Big fan of Jane Eyre, as I say, but, you know, after reading Wide Sargasso Sea, I just don't think I could look at Mr. Rochester the same, you know? Very sad for poor Antoinette. Very, very sad indeed. I would read Wide Sargasso Sea if you haven't already. It's amazing. Now, Johnson disagrees with my take that it's kind of internalized misogyny as her response. He says that the reason that Charlotte Bronte is such a like anti-fan of Jane Austen is because she does not write about the virile man. And, you know, as an anti-fan of the virile man myself, I think that that's a really fair point. You know, Jane Austen writes fictional boyfriends. Let's be real. She writes men who, you know, even if they are not at the beginning of the story kind and generous, become so. They have a character arc. They are changed for the better. They are changed through love. And that is a great arc for a man, but it's also not one that we really see in real life. So, you know, I can understand different strokes for different folks. There's a quote from George Sampson, which is rough, which is that in Jane Austen's world, there is neither marrying nor giving in the act of marriage, but just the make-believe mating of dolls. And then he says, Jane Austen is abnormal because her characters have no sex at all. Now, for me, I question why they don't have sex. And the answer that comes to me is that, as someone who myself has been questioning my own kind of compet for the entire last year and trying to figure out whether I am actually a bisexual or if I'm just a lesbian, and who has only ever really enjoyed heterosexual rom-coms if they are like completely devoid of sex scenes because the sex scenes give me the ick. I mean, think about it. So, am I saying that I think Jane Austen is a lesbian? Yes. Yes, I am actually. I think that she is. I think that there is proof of it, historical. I think that she definitely was gay. And I think that if you want to fight me on that, then meet me in the parking lot and we will go at 5 and I'll probably buy you a milkshake because I'm not a fighter, but I will hear your thoughts and your opinions and I will tell you that you are wrong. And then we can have some chocolate together and a hug. Um, and that's all I have to offer for you. But, we can be best friends. It's fine. So, to close this very, very silly video essay, I think that Jane's work and her life offer a very rich insight into the gender roles and heteronormative norms of the era. And I think that there is sort of juicy, interesting stuff that we can talk about. And in the next video, I'm really looking forward to talking about Pride and Prejudice, one of my favorite books in the entire world, one of my favorite stories. I just think it is so, so, so good. And I also think it has some pretty rich ground for talking about asexuality and different versions of queerness, and definitely some different stuff around gender norms and being outside of the binary and outside of the norm. And I think it'll be really fun. And then the week after that, I'm going to talk about Emma. This series is all about uncovering the layers in Austen's world and Austen's writing. Layers that, much like an onion, linger with us for longer than we would imagine, make us cry.
Or you leave them out in the sun, they get all brown, start sprouting little white hair.
What was I saying? Yes, I hope you enjoyed this as much as I enjoyed making it. I feel like we're best friends now. I feel like we should hang out next week, and whether that is here on YouTube or maybe we should go get coffee. I don't know. What are you doing? Do you want to hang out? Just text me. I'm free all the time. So, love you so much, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.